Welcome to The Whole View. I'm Stacy Top of Real Everything. I'm here each week to dive deeper into how we can find happiness and health inside and out through self-love, finding positivity, and discovering new ways to be our best selves. Before we get started, a reminder, the podcast is for general educational purposes and is not intended to diagnose, advise, or treat any physical or mental illness. And while Dr. Pedre, did I say your name correctly? I
Yes,
did?
Pedre. Yeah,
Is a board certified functional medicine doctor. He's not your doctor. So we always recommend that you see a licensed professional accordingly. Welcome, doctor, to the show. Can I call you is Vincent? Is that correct? Is that
that's
okay?
my first name, Dr. Vincent.
Okay, great. Well, I am excited to introduce our listeners to you. They can find links in the show notes to your Instagram and your TikTok. Kudos to you. We were talking before the show started about having teenagers, and I myself have a lot of teenagers who love TikTok. Tried it myself, just cannot deal. But I know you're there, and you also have a website that we can refer people to that's going to be more related to the topic today, GutSMARTprotocol.com, where people can find follow-up information. And we're going to be talking about your GutSMART protocol, which is a new book that was published just last month, but also your just general experience working with patients, you know, being on social media and the internet and trying to be an educator of health and wellness. So, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I'm going to give our listeners a little introduction in case they aren't familiar with your work already. Dr. Pedre founded Happy Gut Life over a decade ago, and you have devoted your career as a medical doctor to helping patients improve their well being and quality of life by building the foundation of gut health that supports total physical and mental wellness, we're going to talk about that because for me, that's where I think a lot of the wellness industry goes wrong. And I think it's such an important intersection. And you've been a leader in the gut space since your first book, Happy Gut. And your most recent book, The GutSMART Protocol, is a culmination of 20 years of your clinical experience and research as a functional gut expert. And unlike most one size fits all prescriptive health books in the market, this book offers a personalized plan for each reader by having them take the GutSMART quiz, finding the GutSMART score, and then using it to individualize the plan. So I am excited to dive into how you kind of wrap up the summary, which is through it, then we can all learn how to use true wellness to achieve the power of the gut, body, mind, spirit connection. So welcome to the show. For whatever I did not include, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Well, part of the reason that I feel so passionate about gut health and what really drew me to becoming a gut health expert was the fact that I grew up with a whole host of gut issues that turned into IBS, irritable bowel syndrome. And it was because of having been on 20 plus rounds of antibiotics as a child, pretty much destroyed my gut microbiome. I wasn't absorbing my nutrients. I was rail thin, but eating anywhere between 3,000 and 4,000 calories a day. So go figure. And I had developed food sensitivities to wheat or gluten, right? And dairy. So I am I would get sick all the time. I was basically a teenage hypochondriac, afraid to be around sick people because I had such a weak immune system. And the doctors just would give me a multivitamin and say, I need to eat more. I'm like, well, I'm eating a lot and I can't gain weight. And so that was part of the impetus for going to medical school, is kind of figuring out, well, why do I get sick so often? And how is it that I can get better? And, but really didn't make the tie between, the connection between the gut and the immunity and how I was feeling in general until much later. when I had already trained as a internal medicine doctor, and I was still seeking. I was always, I would call myself a truth seeker. So even after 4 years of medical school and 3 years of an evidence-based residency training program in internal medicine, I felt that I had not been shown the entire truth around health. And I was still seeking because I also believed in natural remedies. And I up in a household that my dad took a lot of supplements and, was into like exploring diet and bad oils versus good oils and things like that. So he had a good amount of knowledge, not quite enough, but enough to, I think, imprint on me as a child, even though we thought, we would make fun of it as children, that food is really important. What we eat is really important. And you don't get nutrition training in medical school. So a lot of it I had to do post medical school, reading books, but also attending a lot of medical conferences that dealt with nutrition and functional disorders. And that's where I discovered that my issues with my gut were actually caused by all the antibiotics that I had been on and the food sensitivities that I had. And I started reversing that by fixing my diet, really being conscientious about where food was being sourced, what types of vegetables I was eating or meats and probiotics, fermented foods, all that. And so I just became really curious. So I was already a medical doctor in practice and seeking the answers that I felt were still out there to be found. And I started seeing improvements in how I felt, my energy levels, my mental clarity, all that shifted by taking gluten out of my diet, improving other things about the way that I ate. And I just became really curious about patients when they came in with gut health issues. Because if you look at it from the Western medicine point of view, a gut health patient with IBS is treated with either an antispasmodic, an antidiarrheal, something for constipation, or they're told that they're depressed and they put them on an antidepressant. Those are the options. And
It's managing symptoms, not root cause.
yeah, not and it never felt right to me. It felt like I had been only taught like rudimentary kindergarten language to understand the digestive system. And I wanted grad school level understanding of what was going on. And that's what I discovered through functional medicine, all the root causes and realizing, what we were categorizing as one thing actually could be multiple different things for different people presenting with the same symptoms, but different root causes depending on the person.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that it took a personal experience, right? A lived experience of your own to kind of have not just understanding and compassion for, but an interest in expanding that knowledge beyond the approach that we see in modern medicine. I think there's wonderful value in modern medicine and the tools that we now have to help support people who have symptoms. And we also have a world of knowledge that we can address to reduce symptoms in a more natural or holistic sort of way as well. And when we can marry those two, I find it's often like this weird limbo area in the wellness space where people are often one side or the other, right? Like we want to go all for holistic or we want to go all for modern medicine, but I love being able to support people on kind of both sides and hopefully over time you see less of a need for modern medicine if you're improving in your case gut health, and there could also be other things at play. I don't know how much you know about me or our show, but our prior co-host, Dr. Sarah Ballantyne, was a gut health expert as well. She had a PhD in medical biophysics. So we did a lot of shows diving into the incredible power that your gut has to affect your overall general well-being. And so our listeners are, I think, more educated than most people than you might talk to on this topic. And I think for me, I've come a really long way in my journey of trying to focus on metrics of health for people, right? Instead of where my journey started in this, I wrote books and all the stuff was focused on weight loss. I, as part of that, sacrificed a lot of my health in the process, which I think happens to a lot of people who think weight loss is health versus really listening to your body and leaning into the things that actually improve metrics of health, gut health being one of them, right? Like digestion and gut health is one of the first things that one can point to. So that's why I think it really struck me when you summed up your book and your work as really how true wellness is the power of all of these things coming together, right?
Yeah.
It's your gut, it's your body, it's your mind, it's however you're connecting to the world and community around you. So I know that your book says weight loss, but I have you on this show because I think that I'm going to guess that was a little bit of a marketing shtick and because also, I see the work that you do that you offer more than that. Am I correct in guessing? I'm hoping just a little bit that I've read between the tea leaves there.
Well, I will tell you this from my experience working with patients with gut health issues over the last more than a decade is that what I found is if people who have stunted weight loss, and that can be for many reasons, so call it a weight loss plateau. So you started losing weight, but then you just can't get past a certain point. That's always connected to the gut. There are so many things that the gut is responsible for that can actually, if they're not functioning properly, and that being your gut border, your interface to it's an interface to what I call the inside outside world, right? Because really the inside of our gut is actually part of the outside world. It's just inside of us. And that interface is super important in regulating inflammation in the body. And when that interface gets broken down, then the floodgates open up. I'm actually lecturing this year at the A4M Spring Congress, where I'm talking about the connection between inflammation and the gut and all the research around it, which is amazing because this is not like we're saying, this is all evidence based. We can measure these things in the blood. And we find that endotoxin or lipopolysaccharide, which comes from gram-negative bacteria that live in the gut naturally, but when that gut barrier is broken down, more of that is going to get into the body. And that activates a whole host of inflammatory signals. It scrambles the insulin signal, makes people insulin resistant. So puts the body in a state where you hold on to weight, you pack on more weight in the middle. But when you say my book is more than that, my everything I've done has always been more than that. You know, my, in the book I say gut, body, mind, spirit. And that's really what I do. Sometimes people reach out and want to work with me. And a lot of times it's because they're having some sort of gut health issue. And what they don't realize is, yeah, I'm looking at your body and your whole system from the point of view of the gut and the gut microbiome, but I take into account everything, and you can't be reductionistic, but at the same time, you want to meet people where they're at, right? And people understand diet, nutrition. People understand that something needs to change there if they want to lose weight, if they want to feel better, if they want more energy, if they want to just have vibrant health. My goal with this book has been to show all of the interconnections because I've always been about holistic health. I started meditating and doing breath work when I was 21 years old, 8 months before I went to medical school. And by the time I got into medical school, by the time I started my first year of medical school, I was meditating 5 days per week, 30 minutes each time. And I had also discovered yoga. So before I went to medical school, I got really fascinated with this whole concept of holistic medicine, of looking at the person as a whole, the mind, body, spirit. And my mind was cracked open in such a way that medical school was not able to close it, even though they tried. They tried really hard. But I knew that was the type of doctor that I wanted to be. So before I even ever thought that I was going to be a gut health specialist, what I really wanted to be was a holistic doctor that took into account everything. So there's the mindset part of the piece that I sprinkle in there. And it's so important, and one of the big points that I wanted to get across to people is you can't ignore that part of it, the gut brain connection, the mindset, how your nervous system, how reactive you are, because all of that weighs into your body's ability to heal and to achieve your health goals.
There's so much in what you just said, not the least of which is that you found 30 minutes a day to meditate in medical school, because I think most people don't find that time to go to the restroom or sleep or all these things I hear about medical school. So I know that's one of the recommendations that you have that we'll talk about a little bit later. I am interested to talk more about when you say the gut brain connection, specifically as it relates to the vagus nerve playing a role in both gut and brain health. Can you give some examples of what you mean? I think specifically, how does our gut health impact our mood, our anxiety, our overall mental health, and physical health? I think of it being kind of a true circle of all of those systems working together, which I know you've just described and believe as well. And I think it's helpful for people to understand how that all really interacts.
Yeah, I think there's two important ways to think about it, the gut brain connection. One is the connection that's happening through the autonomic nervous system, specifically the vagus nerve, which is the longest nerve in the body that goes from the brain stem, travels on both sides of the neck here, and then pretty much innervates every single internal organ and controls a lot of what's happening in the background that we don't think about, like enzyme secretion, acid production in the stomach, the peristalsis, the rhythmic contractions of the small intestine. And it's also communicating in the other direction. So it's a bidirectional, and most of the fibers, vagus nerve, are actually pointing back up to the brain from the periphery. 70-80% of the fibers are actually pointing up. Only 20-30% are pointing down. So there's a lot that's of communication that's being sent from the vagal nerve receptors, which are called, a lot of them are 5-HT receptors, 5-hydroxytryptophan, which is basically serotonin, our happiness molecule. And those are being stimulated in the gut by either gut bacteria that are producing serotonin or our own enteroendocrine cells that are in the gut that also produce neurotransmitters and serotonin, stimulate the vagus nerve. Then the second way that you have to think about the gut brain connection is there are these postbiotic products, these metabolites that are being produced by bacteria in the gut. So we call, the good bacteria, we call them probiotics. What they produce and release and then gets absorbed into our circulation are called postbiotics. So, for example, like short chain fatty acids play a really important role. And those travel through our bloodstream and can cross the blood brain barrier. And then, for example, butyrate is what we call a histone acetylase inhibitor. And histone acetylase is an enzyme that controls DNA expression. So it inhibits the histone acetylase, which opens up the DNA to be interpreted in certain areas. And by doing that, it activates the production of a brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a learning factor for the brain. It helps the brain form new neural connections. So learning, memory, all that neuroplasticity is dependent on brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And that's being stimulated by butyrate, which is a postbiotic that's coming from bacteria in the gut and traveling through the bloodstream. So we have both a gut brain connection through the impulses that are being sent through the vagus nerve that then innervate different parts of the brain. And depending on the part of the brain, this is so interesting. The same nerve will send a glutamate signal, which is excitatory, or depending on the region, will send a GABA signal, GABA aminobutyric acid, which is inhibitory. So the vagus is then controlling in through its feedback loop to the brain, activity in the brain. And this becomes really fascinating when you look at studies they've done on patients with treatment resistant depression, where they're on one or two medications and their depression is just not breaking. And they found that their vagal nerve is not firing properly. And there was one study, I'm trying to remember if I quoted in the book because there's so many studies in the book, but there's one study where they basically used an external vagal nerve stimulation device because they're FDA approved vagal nerve stimulation devices that it can be used in the neck or other parts of the body to activate the vagus nerve. There's ones that you can attach here to the tragus, the ear, and that can also activate the vagus. In fact, just a little quick like tidbit, if you're feeling really stressed and you need to get more into parasympathetic state, just grab your tragus and massage it. And that's one way that you can activate the vagus nerve. So they took these patients with treatment resistant depression and they used vagal nerve stimulation device and found that it was about 37% reversed just by activating the vagus nerve. So, and I wanted to share that just to show the power of the vagus nerve and the drastic effects that can happen from having low vagal tone. People, when they get stressed, like if you just went through a breakup, you're going through divorce and you lose your appetite and everything just sits horribly in your stomach, that's low, your vagal tone drops because you're super stressed. If you are under constant fight or flight and everything that you eat just sits wrong in your stomach and you feel like food takes forever to empty from your stomach, that's also another sign of low vagal tone and low stomach acid production. If you suffer from chronic constipation, that can also be a sign of low vagal tone. The anxiety, depression, even low vagal tone has been connected to obesity in some studies. So
I'm fascinated. Sorry to cut you off.
it's okay. Yeah.
You're okay. I want you to have an opportunity to finish talking about it because this is something that really fascinates me. And I feel like it's also the why of Maslow's hierarchy, which I talk about a lot. So as you're talking about all these things, like if your vagal tone is low and you're not functioning, on kind of these basic levels, how can you possibly focus then on, some of the more self-awareness and some of these other
How
things, right?
can your body heal itself? Because if you look at patients here's another model for low vagal tone, a traumatic brain injury patient. So someone who had a concussion that is strong enough to have lost consciousness and ends up in the hospital. They found that within 30 minutes, vagal nerve tone drops and gut permeability goes up. So the vagus, so this is really interesting because we know that gut permeability is being controlled locally by a signaling molecule that is secreted inside the cells that line the intestines called zonulin. And then, of course, all of the structuring of the tight junction proteins, which are like Velcro. But then take vagal tone out and gut permeability goes up. So there's another control mechanism on it. There's multiple different control mechanisms, but the vagus nerve is really important with that. And once gut permeability increases, then inflammation in the body increases.
It's also really interesting to me as we're a foster resource family. I'm a foster mom. We're adopting a traumatized teenager. If you think about any trauma, they've had it. Just being a foster child in and of itself, of course, is a trauma, but like we're talking about extreme.
My
And
gosh. I'm
there,
getting chills because I had a patient this week that I met for the first time and we did a long intake and she's adopted and we went through kind of the story. She's got a lot of gut health issues and we went through the story of her childhood and what she could remember and just things that you might piecemeal in a child that was adopted from foster care, that she was probably not breastfed. So, and breastfeeding and growing up in the 70s when infant formula was not well designed at all. So she wouldn't have developed that very important first colonization of the gut that happens in an infant, which is Bifidobacterium infantis, which so I was doing a presentation last year on the HPA axis, the connection with the gut, and found a really interesting study where they looked at germ-free mice and the development of the HPA axis versus mice that were grown in a bacteria environment. So their gut was colonized with bacteria. And the germ-free mice had a hyperactivation of the HPA axis and the limbic system. So in other words, the part of the brain that is reptilian brain that deals with trauma or like that overactivation. And then if they then did a stool transplant and got the bifidobacterium into the germ-free mice, it modulated how that HPA axis was developing and actually calmed down the limbic system. So, you bring that up, and I think of this study, people are not mice, humans are not mice, are not humans, but that we use them as a really good model to understand what role does gut microbiome play in certain things. And you have to imagine that someone who was adopted or wasn't breastfed, grew up not in a nurturing environment, that their reptilian brain, their limbic system is already hyper wired. It's been traumatized. But the cool thing is that our gut microbiome plays a key significant role, probably based on this study, on the development of how that whole system is regulated.
yeah, I think depending on how long someone is in that situation, I don't want anyone listening to think that just because they didn't breastfeed, that their children weren't raised in a nurturing environment or didn't, are going to inevitably have issues. We do know, however, that if we're not putting those positive bacteria and virus protections and all of these kinds of things from breastfeeding, it is something to be aware of as the child develops. I myself
The
was not a breastfed baby, and I can point to I think a lot of
I
us.
wasn't.
Yeah,
I wasn't breastfed,
the
but I
space age of, humans made it, it must be better was an idea for a really long time, right?
no, like the late 60s, 70s, breast milk was believed to be inferior to formula. And I certainly, luckily grew up in a nurturing environment aside from not having been breastfed. The great thing is that they've now figured it out. And the infant formulas now include human milk oligosaccharides, which are the prebiotics that help colonize the gut with the Bifidobacterium infantis, which is so important. So at least we've come a long way in infant formula
And
from where
that's
we were.
I have no reason to be aware of modern infant formula, having 4 teenagers myself, but that's fascinating. Among my many autoimmune diseases, had massive oversupply when I was breastfeeding my children and donated my milk to specifically, there was an infant who, had been born addicted and was allergic to milk and needed dairy-free breast milk, and it was like, something that I could do at the time. So it's nice to know that there are better options these days and that, science helps to figure all that stuff out. I brought up the adoption specifically because the ACE traumas and other things that our child has been through definitely plays into their physical health, although they have a
Yeah.
freakishly strong immune system. It's like, I don't even understand how it's so strong 'cause it's very different from our family's genetic immune system. I have autoimmune diseases, my mom does, all these things. But they have other factors. They're non-binary, so when I say they, it's one child that play into especially their mental health and their blood sugar regulation and a lot of different medications that they're on that when you were speaking about the vagus nerve, I was just like, "Yep, that's them," like, so much them, and I am fascinated by the idea of beyond therapy, CBD, DBT, and modern medicine, like, what are the things that we can do to help support them improving over time? Like, not only did they have these traumas, but they also grew up in a home where they had cereal and ramen as their main meals for a lot of the time because they were,
Yeah.
making them for themselves. So it's
Yeah.
not like they have this like, great gut health and flora. And I think for a lot of parents or for those of us who, were not breastfed and didn't make the best choices when we were teenagers, yeah, in our 20s, even though our parents may have taught us otherwise. And we're now kind of realizing, oh, shoot, look what I did to my gut health. Or, people who don't necessarily have access to, eating organic, eating the highest forms of oils, all of these things that you mentioned. What are other factors that we can control that can benefit us as we're looking to improve our health and wellness?
Yeah. I mean, I would start with the breath. You know, it's free and everybody has access to it. And most people, when I ask them to show me, take a deep breath, they don't know how to breathe. And not meant as a judgment, but it's just what I've noted over the years. Most people are what we call chest breathers. They're breathing up here with their accessory chest muscles. So if you take a deep breath, you might go like, and all the movement is up here while your stomach is actually sucking in while you're taking that deep breath. But the way we should be breathing is the way that we knew how to breathe when we were babies. If you look at a baby when it's about to start crying, what does it do? It takes a giant, big breath with its diaphragm, and then it wails because it knows it just intuitively, it knows that behind that diaphragm is so much power that they can get a really loud scream or cry. And we lose that, and I think a lot of it is maybe, you can blame it on different things, society, our our concept of beauty, you know, that beauty means your belly is always tucked and tight in and, your chest is out. I mean, just think about like I don't know, when it was this like the late 1800s, the corsets and how important it was to have a really thin waist. And yet you couldn't breathe with that. And what we should be doing is the exact opposite. And what I found with patients, just recently, patient came in with gut issues, but also very anxious. And as part of the visit, I just spent time going through my deep diaphragmatic breathing exercise that I teach people in my book, The GutSMART Protocol. And he's been doing this breathing exercise. He's 20 years old. And already it's caused a shift for him. If he's feeling anxious, he'll stop and breathe and he can feel a shift within a few minutes. And I think that's something really powerful for people to realize. that you have this incredible tool, which is your breath, your lungs, and the muscles in your body. And you just have to learn to use them in a way that supports your nervous system. Because when you breathe deep with your diaphragm, so you're breathing into your lower belly, and that part, your lower part expands, that's activating stretch receptors in the lungs that then activate your parasympathetic nervous system and help that vagus nerve fire, get you into that more relaxed rest and digest state, which is also the state in which the body can heal. So your body's in a state of alert, your body cannot heal. And I think that's first and foremost one of the most important things to do. And then we go into fancier breath work in the book. I interviewed a couple of breath work teachers. One of my favorites is Jesse Gross. He does I think he called it the best rest breath exercise, but it's really a holotropic breath work. So it's a two-part inhale with a single exhale. So you inhale in your lower belly. So it's like, and then you exhale, and you're doing it all through your mouth. It's actually a really powerful breath work for moving emotion, whatever it is that you're feeling. Maybe you're feeling really angry about something, and you just sit and you do this breath work for a couple of minutes, and it's going to move that. Or maybe you're feeling fine and you do the breath work, and at the end of 10 minutes, you find that you're crying and you're not sure why, but it's brought up some emotions. So it's amazing what can be accomplished through this free tool that we all have access to. It's just having the knowledge of how to use it in a way that can benefit your health. And it starts just by deep diaphragmatic breathing. And in those moments, where, you've got the four teenagers and they're driving you nuts, and you got to get food on the table. And you're feeling stressed, and if you can stop for a moment and just take three deep breaths, three diaphragmatic breaths, you can retune your system, get your nervous system calmer, so then you can, handle the outside world better, because it's really our inside state that then determines how we interact with the outside world, but it also determines how well your body can heal.
I discovered breath work when we got COVID for the first time. My husband's an essential worker, and we got it before people were even wearing masks, like way, way in the beginning. And since then, have really started to kind of understand more the science backed incredible power of breath work. And it was incredibly refreshing to see you, a medical doctor, incorporating it not just from a wellness recommendation, but also as support for mental health, because I think for far too long, the brain and the body have been treated separately. I know this is an issue when I'm trying to get support for anyone in my family as it relates to, medication for brain or anything like that. Like it's almost like two different languages that doctors speak and they can't talk to one another. So it is really refreshing to hear the experience and the suggestions and to see the work that you're doing to bring it all together, because we really are one system, right? Like our brain is not completely separate from our body, and we
Mhm.
have to learn to like work those systems together to optimize how we're feeling, whether it's physical or emotional health. And in my stalking of you on the internet before you came on the show, I found this testimony of your work. It was actually a book review. And I want to read it because I think that it really says a lot about your work and speaks to a lot of things that you are explaining. So the reader said, I picked up my much anticipated copy of the GutSMART protocol after Dr. Pedre. I'm I'm really hoping I'm every time I
You
say
you
it,
got it. You got
why
it.
are you sticking on this, Stacy? I don't know. And I've been learning about how gut health affects the body and even mental health. I've struggled with anxiety for a long time, but I didn't realize how important the gut is in shaping our mental health. I knew that sugar and caffeine can increase anxiety, but never understood what role the gut microbiome plays in all of this until picking up this book. It's so easy to read, making the science understandable for someone like me who was never good at science in school. It's actually the first time that reading any science of the gut and how we can be healthier and heal our bodies by healing our gut isn't boring me. I'm so glad I decided to get this book. I also have some gut issues related to my anxiety. Of course you do. We all do. If you've got one, you've got the other. And this protocol makes a lot of sense. I started doing some of the breath work and meditation exercises in chapters 11 and 12, and they are already helping. The gut brain connection is powerful. Wow. So kudos to
Yeah.
you. I thought it was such a great kind of summary of all the different things that you're talking about and how to bring it together. And for me, the breathwork element is it's both a short-term solution. Like I have literally been able to help a child through a panic attack by practice breathing. I have a neurodiverse child as well who when the impulse control gets out, like we sit and we breathe. We just take 3 deep diaphragm breaths. Just 3 breaths is all I like have to get him to do in order to feel better. And then he can kind of process what he's feeling or use his words or whatever. And I think knowing the impact that has had both on, lung health through COVID for me, as well as like mental health with my children, I loved seeing that was something that you're supporting. And I want to point our listeners to on your website, the GutSMART protocol, you can go to slash recordings and you have a ton of video and audio recordings that people can take advantage of
Yeah.
that, pair with the book, but you can also just go to Dr. Vincent's website and check some of these out. I think, we've talked about some of these practical strategies and non-food factors, as I like to refer to them. I myself was on an elimination diet for basically a decade. And I think ultimately it ended up doing more harm than good for me. I did figure out the foods that are inflammation triggering foods for me. But when I took away caffeine and when I started breathing and actually reducing my stress, it had, a 10x impact on my health over, a
Huge.
lot of the other things. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I appreciate like all these different things and that review brought in the caffeine element as well. And I'm like, yes, like I know nobody wants to hear it, but it was like literally life changing for me. But I'm wondering before we kind of part ways, if you could share any other impactful actions that we can take as we walk away today to improve our health. So I know you've talked about massaging your tragus to activate your vagus nerve. We've talked about breathing. I always like to leave listeners with something positive and actionable that they can walk away and implement after they've listened to the podcast. Is there anything else that you can think of that would be helpful for them?
Yeah. I mean, so many things. So many things. I was thinking about sharing how I fell into depression when I finished college. I finished in 3.5 years, then went back home, and I had 8 months before medical school. And I said that I had discovered meditation and breath work 8 months before I started medical school. I was also pretty depressed. I think just from the come down from having the intensity of college to just suddenly coming home and not having a lot to do and just having like this big space. And that was the time that I discovered breath work meditation. And I created a vision board. And that vision board, along with the breath work and meditation, basically helped me get out of my depression without medication, without any other interventions, just really positive interventions. And I've kind of experimented with that over the years and had my own mental health issues, being vulnerable here. And I've always found that cleaning up the diet, like you were saying, the diet is important because that's the foundation, right? That's the foundation of our bodies. If the foundation is not good, then it's going to be hard even if you're trying to do a lot of mental health stuff. But if you're eating a lot of sugar and processed foods and things like that, it's like you're doing two things that are opposing each other. So you always want to build that foundation. And then on top of that, but you're not going to achieve total physical, mental, spiritual well being if all you do is build the physical foundation, but you don't address the mental and emotional parts of it. So incorporating the breath work. And really, I mean, I think we probably have an epidemic of vagal nerve dysfunction worldwide. And one of the things, I don't know if you've ever listened to Tibetan monks chant. I was in Aspen and a friend invited me to go. They had a group of Tibetan monks and they were going to be meditating and chanting, and you could sit and participate with it. And I can tell you the chanting does something to the mind. Like it puts your brain in an altered state. I felt so relaxed, but at the same time aware and elevated. And one of the ways to activate the vagus nerve is to sing, to chant, to hum. If you can't even sing, if you can just hum a melody or just do some inhalations with humming. So I'll have people do 5 minutes of breath work, and with every exhale, they're humming the exhale. So when you hum, that vibration here stimulates the vagus nerve. And it's a good way to, again, another biohack that is free that you carry with you at all times that can start to change your internal state, which then allows you to do other positive things for your health. So there you go.
I love that, not only because the phrase of you saying, "I was in Aspen and I got invited to go to a Tibetan monk humming session," will forever live in my mind, free read, but also because I myself find that one of the ways that I lift myself up and lift my kids up is by singing and dancing. Like, we will oftentimes they get cranky when they have to do chores or whatever it is, so we turn on music in the kitchen, and I choose the most obnoxious music that I know that they not sing to, oftentimes 90s pop or 2000s, and, get them engaged, and I always thought like, "Oh, it's a boost to their positive brain hormones to laugh and dance and sing," but it hadn't occurred to me that it was also kind of activating vagus nerve or different areas as well. So I'm just gonna, little pat on my mom back, like, yep, keep doing that thing. But it just goes to show that it really can be little things that we bring into our life of, creating a vision board, making more time to sing, or doing simple breathing exercises that can have a big impact on our health. And I think these things are not talked about often enough. I mean, at the top of the show, you said people associate, health and wellness with diet and nutrition. And therefore, it's kind of the go to for people and it's a language they understand. And yet, we know scientifically and from what you're seeing in your patients and all this kind of stuff that it can't just be in a vacuum. If all people are doing is continuing to live their very stressed out life, taking a probiotic or a supplement and being restrictive with their diet, they're not going to have the same kind of results as if they're really kind of like looking at their lifestyle overall and saying, this is not the life that I want to live, right? Like, I'm living in this hyper stressed out state all the time.
And don't wait for a crisis to
Mm.
happen, because what happens to a lot of people who live in hyper stressed out states is it takes a crisis in their lives to finally get them to change.
And it's that much harder once you've gone like over the edge versus if, start to implement things for yourself sooner, that it can be a slow burn. It can be something that you do, transition in time and implement sustainable changes. I think it's impossible to, be successful when you have to completely change your life because you've, had a crisis, you're in a crisis, and then you're like, and now I'm going to change everything about your life altogether. And it feels impossible. It feels overwhelming when you're in that state. So I think that's a great point. And thank you, Doctor, for coming on the show. I want to remind listeners they can find you on Instagram and TikTok as Dr. Pedre, as well as GutSmartProtocol.com. I'm sure all of your links and stuff are on GutSmartProtocol.com. So if people just
Yeah.
went there, they could find all your socials and everything.
Yeah.
And your new book, The GutSMART Protocol, I know it's on Amazon. We'll put a link in the show notes. Is it available at you know, bookstores and everywhere people can find books? Yes.
Yeah. Barnes and Noble, bookshop.org if you want to support smaller bookshops, and not support the big monsters.
Love it. Shop. I love my local bookshop. If you're looking to pick it up quickly, you can also, as you said, find the links in the and listeners will be sharing what we really thought over on patreon.com/the whole view, which is the best place to ask questions. If you love the show that we create and produce ourselves, a Patreon is a great way to support the show. But so is just leaving a review in whatever app you're listening. Follow, subscribe, and share this podcast if you've enjoyed it or you know someone that you think would enjoy it. Pass the link and it will help others find us as well. I want to thank you for tuning in today. We appreciate your willingness to be open to growth through your own personal change. No one is perfect, but in listening, learning, and unlearning, we can become better versions of ourselves. Thanks, listeners. Thank you so much for being on the show.